If you were to stand on the flat plains of Mesopotamia some 4,000 years ago, the night would unfold above you in quiet detail. There were no street lamps, no electric glow rising from distant cities, no headlights cutting across the darkness. The landscape itself was flat, offering little obstruction to the horizon, and the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates moved steadily under the faint shimmer of starlight. The air was dry, and in many seasons the sky remained cloudless. In such an environment, the heavens were not only visible, but impossible to ignore. Night after night, season after season, the same stars returned, rising and setting, in their slow, dependable patterns. The Babylonians were not the first to notice this. Every culture in its own way had eyes turned upward. Hunters, farmers, sailors, all had reasons to glance at the constellations. But the Babylonians did something unusual, something that would appear mundane to us today, but in their context was both peculiar and foundational. They wrote it all down. In the clay-rich soil of Mesopotamia, they pressed wedge-shaped signs into damp tablets, cataloging stars, planets, and strange movements in the sky. And unlike the fleeting beauty of starlight itself, these clay tablets endured. Some still sit in museum drawers today, broken but legible. The Babylonians cataloged stars with a precision that at first seems excessive. Lists of constellations were made not as fanciful myths, but as systematic inventories. They identified the paths of planets across the zodiac. They noted eclipses, conjunctions, risings, and settings. These records stretch across centuries, copied by scribes, updated, revised, and expanded. Yet there is something quietly paradoxical in this work. Most of the stars they recorded were not particularly useful to ordinary people. Farmers needed seasonal cues. Priests needed omens. Rulers occasionally needed signs of legitimacy. But vast numbers of the recorded stars had little practical function. The sky was larger than its usefulness, and Babylonian scribes filled their tablets with information few outside their circle would ever need. Why did they do it? The answer begins with the peculiar blend of religion, administration, and survival that structured Babylonian life. For them, the sky was not only a calendar, but also a message board from the gods. Every star that flickered might signify something. The difficulty lay in interpreting it. Much like an archive of official correspondence, the heavens were thought to contain messages, some meaningful, some trivial. By recording everything, the Babylonians hoped nothing of importance would slip through unnoticed. Cataloging stars no one watched was, in a sense, a form of bureaucratic diligence. It was the cosmic equivalent of filing every letter in triplicate, just in case one mattered. The environment of Mesopotamia contributed to this habit of careful record-keeping. The land between the rivers was fertile, but unpredictable. Floods could come suddenly, ruining crops. Droughts could leave fields parched. Political authority shifted frequently as city-states rose and fell, and empires swallowed one another in turn. In such instability, there was a longing for something that appeared stable, something that could be trusted across the rise and fall of kings. The stars, with their regular cycles, seemed to provide this. If one could track their patterns with enough detail, perhaps one could anticipate the future, or at least be better prepared for the surprises of fate. Thus, the Babylonian star catalogues were born. They began with simple lists naming the constellations along the path of the moon. The earliest known catalog, sometimes referred to as the three stars. Each text divided the heavens into three regions: the path of Anu, the path of Enlil, and the path of Ea. Three great gods who, in theory, governed the divisions of the sky. In each region, stars were listed with three assigned to each month of the year. It was both a calendar and a map, simultaneously religious and practical. For modern readers, it feels like a compromise between myth and measurement. Not quite science, not quite story, but something in between. Over centuries, these lists grew more detailed. They included not only the stars themselves, but also the movements of planets. Venus in particular fascinated the Babylonians. The planet's bright light and unusual cycles made it a focus of both astronomy and omen literature. Records of its rising and setting were inscribed on tablets, such as the famous Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to the mid-2nd millennium BCE. These records were not casual observations. They were systematic, stretching over years, repeating in predictable cycles. By writing them down, scribes created a database, long before the term existed, a slow accumulation of observations meant to be useful for diviners and priests. To modern eyes, the clay tablets appear dull. Rows of cuneiform signs, sometimes damaged, often repetitive, fill their surfaces. They list the same stars over and over, marking their appearances in different months or their relations to the lunar path. It feels redundant, even tedious. Yet this tedium was the point. The Babylonians trusted not inspiration, but accumulation. Knowledge was built not through sudden flashes of insight, but through endless repetition, comparison, and compilation. If one tablet contradicted another, scribes did not erase, but recopied, preserving the variant. Accuracy was achieved not through pruning, but through redundancy. And so long into the night as others in Babylon slept, scribes pressed their reeds into clay, capturing the sky in miniature. They must have known that few would ever read their work. The farmer in his field, the merchant on his boat, the soldier on his march. They had no need for star catalogs. The audience was narrow priests at temples, diviners at courts, and students in scribal schools. Still, the effort continued. Star by star, line by line, Babylonian astronomy became a library of unnoticed detail. This raises a quiet question, one that lingers across the centuries. Why did they care so much about stars that no one watched? Was it faith? Bureaucratic habit? A desire to impose order on the uncontrollable? Or was there something else? Something we have not yet fully understood. Section 2. Scribes. Temples and the machinery of the sky. If you picture a Babylonian scribe at work, the image may not be of a stargazer peering through the night, but rather of a seated figure indoors, reed stylus in hand, pressing marks into a damp tablet. The connection between the stars overhead and the symbols on clay was not always direct. Many scribes copied from older tablets, instead of observing the heavens themselves. Knowledge of the sky was accumulated not by each individual, but by a chain of students, masters, and institutions who preserved the work across generations. In this sense, Babylonian astronomy was less about isolated genius and more about bureaucratic continuity. The temple played a central role. Babylonian religion treated the sky as a text written by the gods. To read it required discipline training and, above all, patience. Temples supported schools where scribes learned to read and write, cuneiform to copy older works, and to memorize lists. These schools were not glamorous. The clay exercises of students, many of which survive, are repetitive drills. A single star name might be written again and again across a practice tablet. Errors were corrected by the master, and the student would try once more. The process mirrored the stars themselves, repetitive, predictable, stable. From this educational foundation, the great catalogs were sustained. Each generation of scribes inherited not only tablets, but also the responsibility of maintaining them. Copying was never exact yet. It was never wholly free. Scribes were bound by tradition, encouraged to preserve rather than innovate. The consequence of this was that Babylonian astronomy grew like a sedimentary layer. New observations were added, but old ones remained, even if no longer relevant. A catalog might contain both precise planetary data and archaic star names long since unused. This mix gave their work a curious texture, at once practical and outdated modern for its time, yet already ancient in form. The temple context also shaped the purpose of these star lists. They were rarely neutral. A star was not merely a point of light. It was an omen waiting to be interpreted. If Venus rose earlier than expected, if Mars appeared near a certain constellation, if an eclipse darkened the moon, the event might carry meaning for the king for the crops, or for the health of the realm. The catalog, then, was not just a record, it was a reference library for diviners. With it, priests could compare the present sky to past observations and identify what was ordinary and what was extraordinary. Only in recognizing the ordinary could one isolate the truly unusual, and the unusual was where divine communication might be found. Yet this reliance on catalogs created its own peculiar problem. The more one recorded, the more one had to explain. A bright comet in the sky might be easy enough to interpret as a sign of upheaval. But what of a faint star, listed on a tablet, one that few had noticed before, moving slightly out of alignment with the lunar path? Was it a message from the gods, or was it meaningless? By cataloging so many stars, the Babylonians gave themselves the burden of accounting for them. Every mark on a tablet implied potential significance. The heavens became crowded, not only with stars, but with expectations. There was also a political dimension. Kings valued omens, but they valued loyalty even more. The court diviners were in a precarious position. A favorable interpretation might please the ruler, while an unfavorable one could risk disfavor or worse. In such a climate, detailed records served as a kind of protection. A scribe could point to a tablet and say, "This is not my opinion. This is what has been observed for centuries." The authority of the catalog shielded the interpreter. Knowledge was bureaucratized, depersonalized, made safer by being attributed to tradition rather than individual judgment. At the same time, the daily life of an ordinary Babylonian was far removed from these concerns. Most people rose with the sun and labored in fields, tended animals, baked bread, and fetched water. Their survival depended less on catalogs and more on weather harvests and local trade. The sky mattered to them in a more immediate sense. It told them when to plant, when to reap, when the river might flood. The elaborate star lists of the scribes were remote, almost irrelevant. Yet through the machinery of temple and state, the knowledge of the scribes shaped calendars, festivals, and royal decisions, which in turn affected the rhythms of everyday life. The connection was indirect but real. What makes the Babylonian case so striking is the sheer endurance of this system. For more than 1,000 years, scribes copied, updated, and maintained astronomical texts. Dynasties fell, cities were sacked, empires shifted from Assyrian to Babylonian to Persian control, but the star catalogs remained. Their persistence speaks less of any single insight and more of institutional inertia. Once the practice of cataloging stars had begun, it became self-sustaining. To stop would have been to abandon a tradition, to break the chain of authority, to neglect the gods' messages. And so the tablets multiplied. Today, fragments of these catalogs sit in museums, often broken into pieces. Archaeologists painstakingly reassemble them, aligning wedges of clay like puzzle parts. The result is a patchwork picture, partial lists, damaged lines, missing stars. Yet even in their incompleteness, the tablets speak of an astonishing patience. Each line, each wedge was pressed with care, even if it recorded a star that few had ever seen. In reading them, you are left with an odd impression. The Babylonians catalogued not only the sky, but also their own persistence. They were meticulous in ways that seemed disproportionate to their needs. They filled shelves with tablets that recorded events of little consequence. And yet, because of this, they created a foundation upon which later civilizations would build. The Greeks, centuries later, would inherit fragments of Babylonian astronomy. Modern science, much further on, would recognize in these records the first attempts at systematic observation. What seemed boring in its own time became essential in retrospect. Still, one wonders, did the scribes themselves ever sense the weight of their work? Did they realize that in writing down the unnoticed stars, they were preserving a tradition that would outlast empires? Or were they simply following orders, copying lines because that was what scribes had always done? Section 3. The legacy of stars no one watched. Imagine a Babylonian scribe setting down his stylus after pressing the last wedge into clay. The tablet he has created joins dozens of others stacked in temple storage or filed among archives that smell of earth and dust. For him, it is a task completed. For us, thousands of years later, it is a record of persistence. These catalogs of stars, copied and recopied for centuries, might have seemed trivial to their makers, but they became part of a chain of human thought that reached far beyond the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Babylonians had no telescopes, no advanced mathematics of orbits, no modern sense of astronomy as a science. Yet they managed to accumulate data with a consistency that few other cultures matched in the ancient world. Their observations of lunar eclipses stretched across centuries. Their records of Venus were among the most precise of antiquity. They did not explain the mechanisms of the heavens in the way later Greek philosophers attempted, but they provided the raw material upon which others could build. In this sense, the catalogs were less about comprehension and more about endurance. What makes their achievement remarkable is not the brilliance of any one discovery, but the dullness of their method. They recorded everything. They copied everything. They tolerated redundancy, contradiction, and repetition. In modern scientific practice, efficiency is prized, unnecessary data is trimmed, irrelevant notes discarded. But Babylonian astronomy thrived on accumulation. By refusing to throw anything away, they preserved knowledge that otherwise would have been lost. The result was a continuity of information rare in the ancient world. This habit of record-keeping shaped more than astronomy. It reflected the Babylonian worldview, where order came from classification, where the divine was encountered through careful attention, and where stability was pursued through repetition. Their catalogs were not just lists of stars. They were demonstrations of loyalty to tradition, affirmations of faith, and acts of bureaucratic diligence. Each tablet was an attempt to stabilize a world that was in reality unstable. Floods came, empires fell, rulers died, but the stars remained, and the tablets that named them offered a small sense of permanence. Over time, the influence of these star catalogs spread beyond Mesopotamia. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in the 4th century BCE, Greek scholars encountered the Babylonian astronomical tradition. Later, the Seleucid rulers who inherited part of Alexander's empire maintained Babylonian scribal schools, and for centuries, Greek and Mesopotamian traditions blended. Greek astronomy, which prized theoretical models, absorbed Babylonian data, which provided the long-term records necessary to test hypotheses. Without the Babylonian tablets, Greek theorists like Hipparchus and Ptolemy would have had far less material upon which to build their celestial systems. The transmission did not stop there. From Greek sources, knowledge flowed into Roman and later Islamic scholarship, and from there into medieval Europe. Each step reinterpreted the Babylonian legacy, often without acknowledging its origin. By the time European astronomers of the Renaissance rediscovered the value of precise observation, the Babylonian precedent was long forgotten. Yet, in an indirect way, the clay tablets of Mesopotamia had laid part of the groundwork for the scientific revolution. It is curious to reflect that the Babylonians themselves did not aim at science in the modern sense. They were not trying to uncover universal laws or physical mechanisms. They were trying to read the will of the gods. For them, the stars were signs, not systems. And yet, by writing so much down, they created the conditions for others to see more than they did. The very act of cataloging, of refusing to ignore even the dullest star, gave future generations the tools to measure cycles, predict eclipses, and, eventually, uncover the mechanics of the cosmos. There is a quiet lesson in this. Much of what endures in history is not the spectacular, but the routine. The Babylonian scribes working late into the night with clay and reed were not celebrated innovators. They were copyists, functionaries, keepers of dusty traditions. Their work was to them repetitive and obligatory. Yet because they persisted, their tablets outlasted empires and shaped knowledge far beyond their imagining. What was once the work of a few temple scribes became part of the backbone of human understanding of the heavens. Today, if you walk through a museum and glance at a Babylonian star tablet, you may find it underwhelming. The marks are small, the translations, dull lists of names, numbers, notations about risings and settings. But behind that surface lies a discipline of patience. The Babylonians catalogued stars that no one watched, and in doing so, they created a model of endurance that still speaks to us. It reminds us that the progress of knowledge often rests not on sudden brilliance, but on slow, careful, and boring work. And so, as the stars continue to move across our modern skies, most of us never look up, never notice, never care. Yet the catalogs remain silent witnesses to a time when the heavens were watched with relentless attention. Perhaps the final question lingers in the quiet of that thought. If they found meaning in watching unnoticed stars, what unnoticed details of our own age might carry meaning for the future? Story 2. Clay Tablets and Quiet Observers. Recording the Night Sky in Cuneiform Section 1. The Weight of Clay and the Scratch of Reeds. If you imagine the great sweep of Babylonian astronomy, you might think of grand constellations of priests staring into the heavens, or of kings waiting anxiously for omens. Yet the real work of Babylonian star recording did not happen under the open sky. It happened indoors in small rooms, lit by oil lamps, where scribes bent over damp clay with sharpened reeds. The true machinery of their astronomy was not the human eye gazing upward, but the stylus pressing downward. Clay was both abundant and practical. Along the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates riverbeds yielded an endless supply. When kneaded and dampened, the clay became a pliable surface soft enough to take the impression of a stylus, but firm enough to retain its shape. A Babylonian scribe would scoop clay, form it into a rectangular tablet, and smooth its surface like a blank page. The reed stylus, cut at an angle, was pressed into the clay to create wedge-shaped impressions, the cuneiform signs. These signs were not drawn, but stamped each stroke angled and deliberate. Once the writing was complete, the tablet could be dried in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanence. This medium shaped the way Babylonians thought and wrote. Unlike parchment or paper, clay did not allow for erasure. A mistake could be corrected only by scraping off the surface or starting again. The permanence of clay demanded care, but it also made survival possible. Thousands of years later, fragile though they are, the tablets endure, when papyrus and parchment have long since vanished. The star catalogs survive, not because they were treasured, but because they were baked earth. The process of recording the night sky in cuneiform was slow. A single tablet might contain a list of stars rising in particular months, or the first and last visibility of a planet like Venus. Each entry required not only writing, but calculation. A scribe needed to know how to express numbers in the Babylonian sexagesimal system, where 60 served as the base rather than 10. Angles in the sky, times of rising, or divisions of the calendar, all were recorded in multiples of 60. This demanded a precision that modern readers sometimes underestimate. The Babylonian scribes were not casual note-takers. They were meticulous craftsmen of numbers. Their observational methods were simple but effective. Without telescopes, they relied on the naked eye, but the flat horizon of Mesopotamia gave them a clear vantage. By marking where stars appeared relative to the horizon, by noting the days between risings and settings, they could track cycles with surprising accuracy. Over years, patterns emerged. The moon's eclipses, for instance, could be predicted based on these accumulated records. But the act of prediction was secondary to the act of inscription. What mattered most was that each event, no matter how ordinary, was written down. Scribal training was essential. Boys entering temple schools learned first to shape letters, then to copy standard texts. Star lists formed part of the advanced curriculum, combining writing practice with specialized knowledge. A student might copy the names of constellations again and again until his hand learned the shapes of the wedges. In doing so, he also absorbed the catalogs themselves. Knowledge passed not only through reading, but through the muscle memory of writing. To be a scribe of the heavens was to embody the data, to have your hand repeat what your eye might never see directly. The work could be monotonous. Hours of pressing wedges into clay recording stars that were rarely looked at must have tested patience. Yet monotony was part of the value. In Babylonian culture, repetition was a virtue. Just as prayers were recited again and again and rituals performed with exact sameness, so too were the catalogs maintained. Repetition created reliability. By writing down what had already been written, the scribes ensured continuity, and continuity was a form of truth. Inside temple storerooms, shelves were stacked with tablets. Some were large, filled with dense rows of cuneiform. Others were small, pocket-sized, for personal use. Over time, tablets broke, cracked, or crumbled, but the scribal tradition was stronger than the material. Broken tablets could be recopied, their text reconstructed from older versions. This redundancy was not seen as wasteful, but as necessary. To copy was to preserve, and to preserve was to honor both the gods and the past. In this way, Babylonian astronomy was never the work of an individual genius, but of a collective. The catalogs were not the vision of one man staring at the stars, but the accumulation of hundreds of scribes, pressing wedges into clay over centuries. Their names are largely lost. Their work survives only in fragments. But together, they created one of the earliest archives of systematic observation known to humanity. As you hold in your mind the image of a Babylonian scribe, at his table pressing wedge after wedge into clay. You might wonder, did he feel he was serving the gods, the king, or simply the demands of tradition? Was he aware that his quiet labor would survive thousands of years? Or was he only focused on filling a tablet before the clay dried too hard to take the mark? Temples courts and the uses of written stars, the Babylonian scribes, who inscribed the heavens into clay, were not free agents. Their work was bound to institutions that gave it meaning, direction, and purpose. Chief among these were the temples, the courts of kings, and the bureaucracies that linked religion with politics. To understand why star catalogs mattered, one must imagine not only the lone scribe with his stylus, but also the larger machinery in which he was only one cog. Temples were the heart of the system. In Mesopotamian cities, temples were not merely houses of worship. They were economic, administrative, and educational centers. Grain was stored there, contracts sealed, and apprentices trained. The temple's scribal school was where boys learned to read and write, where they copied hymns, lists, and contracts, and eventually where advanced students encountered astronomy. Astronomy itself was considered part of divination, the art of reading the will of the gods. Just as a priest might examine the liver of a sacrificed sheep, so too might another priest consult a tablet of stars. Both were seen as legitimate ways of hearing divine messages. The court, meanwhile, demanded these messages. Kings wanted reassurance that the gods favored their rule, that campaigns would be successful, that harvests would be plentiful. A favorable omen could bolster confidence. An unfavorable one could breed anxiety. Astronomical tablets thus served as reference works. When a strange event occurred in the night sky, an eclipse, a bright comet, or a planet lingering unusually long near a constellation, the king's diviners could consult the tablets. What had been recorded in the past? Did such an event bring victory or disaster? The catalog turned observation into precedent, and precedent into prophecy. This gave the scribes' work a political edge. Accuracy mattered, but so did interpretation. If a tablet suggested that an eclipse meant harm to the king, the diviner might soften the reading, assigning the ill omen to a rival or to an enemy city instead. The presence of the tablet lent authority, but authority could be bent. The records were not neutral data. They were instruments in negotiations between priestly authority and royal power. In this sense, the clay tablets were less scientific notebooks than political tools. Yet not every use was so dramatic. Many tablets served quieter bureaucratic functions. A farmer might not care about the stars cataloged in Anu's path, but the calendar that structured his planting was shaped by them. Festivals, fasts, and rituals were timed according to celestial cycles. When the new moon was sighted, priests declared the beginning of a new month, which determined the schedule of offerings and temple services. The tablets that recorded star positions supported these calendrical decisions, providing a framework for the rhythm of community life. It is easy, looking back, to separate the practical from the religious. But in Babylonian thought, the two were inseparable. The gods governed the natural world, and to record natural phenomena was to document divine action. A star was not just a point of light, but an intentional sign placed by the gods in the sky. Even when a star seemed irrelevant, it was recorded because one could never be sure. The assumption was that everything might matter, and only the full catalog could reveal what the gods intended. Still, the act of writing itself conferred power. To inscribe a star into clay was to give it permanence, to fix it in human memory, to make it accessible to interpretation. Oral tradition might forget. Clay remembered. In this way, the Babylonians harnessed their environment, the abundance of clay, to construct a permanent conversation with the heavens. Unlike fleeting spoken omens, written omens could be revisited, reinterpreted, and repurposed. A star's meaning might change, but the record remained. This continuity required organization. Temple libraries were carefully maintained with shelves and boxes filled with tablets, sorted by type hymns, legal contracts, medical texts, omen series, and astronomical catalogs. Some libraries contained thousands of tablets. Excavations at sites like Nineveh and Sippar reveal the scope of these collections. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, though Assyrian rather than Babylonian, demonstrates the principle a ruler could command scribes to gather every kind of knowledge from myths to mathematics and bind it into his reign through clay. Babylonian star catalogs existed within this larger encyclopedic impulse, where to rule was also to preserve. There was, however, a tension between abundance and obscurity. The more tablets that were copied, the more fragmented the knowledge became. Some texts circulated widely. Others languished in temple storerooms, read by few and used by fewer. It is possible that many star catalogs were rarely consulted, their lines of cuneiform waiting silently on clay that few eyes would see. Yet, they were still copied century after century. Tradition carried them forward, even when utility did not. And so Babylonian astronomy endured, not because it was always needed, but because it was always maintained. In this, it resembled other aspects of Mesopotamian life rituals, performed even when their meaning was forgotten, hymns, sung whose deities were half obscured by time, legal forms repeated long after their origins were unclear. Continuity was valued over innovation, preservation over novelty. Yet, one question lingers in the quiet of these libraries. Did the scribes themselves ever wonder whether they were recording too much? Did they ever pause stylus in hand and ask whether every faint star deserved a place in clay? Or was the very act of writing its own justification, the process, more important than the product? Section 3. Fragments, Survival, and the Silent Afterlife of Clay. When archaeologists first began to excavate the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, in the 19th century they were not greeted by monuments of marble or scrolls of parchment. Instead, they found heaps of broken clay. Thousands upon thousands of tablets lay buried in the earth, many reduced to fragments, their wedge-shaped impressions dulled by time. At first glance, they seemed unimpressive, mere rubble. Yet within these brittle shards lay the voices of Babylonian scribes, preserved not by intention, but by accident. Clay was paradoxically both fragile and durable. A tablet dropped could shatter. One exposed to water could dissolve. But if buried in the right conditions, clay could last for millennia. Fires that destroyed libraries often baked tablets harder, unintentionally ensuring their survival. Entire collections reduced to charred ruins became time capsules for modern researchers. The very material that made Babylonian writing so plain, so earthy, also made it enduring. From these fragments, scholars pieced together the astronomical tradition. A single catalog might be spread across several broken tablets, each part discovered decades apart in different digs. The process of reconstruction mirrored the work of the scribes themselves, slow, repetitive, meticulous. Just as Babylonian students once copied wedge after wedge, modern Assyriologists copy signs into dictionaries, align fragments, and restore lost lines. The continuity of patience bridges centuries. What emerges from these reconstructions is a picture not of brilliance, but of endurance. The Babylonian star catalogs do not dazzle with sudden insights. They are not dramatic theories of the cosmos, nor are they rich mythic tales. Instead, they are lists, constellations, assigned to months, records of risings and settings, series of numerical notations. They read like ledgers, and in a sense, that is what they were, the heavens turned into accounts. Yet it was precisely this dullness that made them useful to later cultures. The Greeks, inheriting Babylonian data, could overlay their theories upon it. The Islamic astronomers of the Middle Ages drew upon the numerical patterns. Even modern science has retraced lunar cycles using Babylonian observations. But what of the scribes themselves? For most, anonymity was their fate. The majority of tablets are unsigned. A few carry colophons, short notes naming the scribe his teacher, or the temple school where the tablet was copied. These brief mentions are all that remain of individual lives. Behind each tablet was a person seated at a table, stylus in hand, perhaps weary after a day of copying, perhaps proud of his neat wedges. The clay preserves their labor, but not their voices. They are silent observers, their names dissolved while their work endures. It is worth pausing to consider how easily this tradition could have vanished. Had the clay not been durable, had the scribes used papyrus or parchment, instead almost nothing would remain. The floodplains of Mesopotamia are harsh on organic material. Fires, rains, and insects destroy. The sheer dullness of clay, its heaviness, its lack of beauty, its resistance to casual storage, turned out to be its gift to history. What seemed unremarkable in its own age became priceless in ours. Today, if you visit a museum collection, you may see Babylonian star tablets displayed behind glass. To most visitors, they are opaque. The wedge-shaped signs are unfamiliar. The translation placards terse. Many walk past without pause. Yet for those who stop, there is something almost moving in their ordinariness. A tablet that once sat on a temple shelf in Babylon, copied by a nameless scribe, now rests under artificial light in London, Berlin, or Baghdad. Across thousands of years, the line of transmission continues. And so the Babylonian star catalogues remind us of an uncomfortable truth about history. Much of what matters is boring. Empires rise and fall in bursts of drama, but what endures are the ledgers, the contracts, the catalogs. These are not the stories sung by poets, but the records kept by clerks. The Babylonians, by inscribing stars that no one watched, became participants in a long chain of human patience. Their legacy lies not in spectacle, but in survival. Perhaps this is the quiet power of clay, to preserve what was never meant to be grand. The scribes did not imagine that their lists would travel millennia. They wrote because tradition required it, because temples demanded it, because students needed practice. Yet their dull diligence became our inheritance. Without their tablets, our knowledge of ancient astronomy would be fragmentary at best. With them, we glimpse a world where even unnoticed stars were thought worthy of record. As you picture the museum, glass, the fragment of clay behind it, and the wedge-shaped marks pressed by a hand long gone, you might ask yourself how much of what we record today will endure. Which of our own routines, our data, our catalogs, so boring to us now, will one day become the fragments through which others reconstruct our world? Story 3. Priests, omens and calendars. The uses of astronomical boredom. Dissection 1. Reading the sky as a message. If you lived in Babylon and looked up at the stars, you would not see them as silent, indifferent lights. You would see them as messages. To the Babylonian mind, the heavens were a great tablet inscribed by the gods, their meanings hidden in cycles of light and shadow, in wandering planets and sudden eclipses. Reading the sky was not a hobby or an idle curiosity. It was a form of divination, as serious as any sacrifice at the temple altar. Priests were the interpreters of these signs, known as Tupshar Enuma, Anu, Enlil, scribes of the omen series Enuma, Anu, and Lil. They devoted themselves to the careful comparison of celestial events with human affairs. The omen series itself was vast, containing hundreds of tablets, each listing possible phenomena and their corresponding outcomes. An eclipse in one month might mean famine, in another, the downfall of a king. The rising of Venus at dawn could foretell peace or war, depending on where in the sky it appeared. For the priests, these correspondences were not speculation, but tradition, rooted in centuries of recorded precedent. It was here that the star catalogues met their purpose. By recording every visible event, scribes created a library of cases. The heavens became a vast archive, and each new observation could be slotted into its proper category. To the priestly mind, there was no such thing as chance. If Mars burned red near a certain star, if the moon disappeared behind shadow, if a comet streaked across the night, it was a message waiting to be decoded. And decoding it required reference to the tablets, those accumulations of earlier observations. The uses of these omens were not merely spiritual, but deeply political. Kings wanted certainty in uncertain times. Before a campaign, they asked the priests, would the gods favor them in battle? Before a great building project, they asked, would the foundations hold? An unfavorable omen could alter royal plans, delay campaigns, or even lead to elaborate rituals designed to divert the predicted disaster. Sometimes, a substitute king was appointed temporarily, bearing the bad fate so that the true monarch might be spared. The stars thus held tangible influence over life, and death, power, and weakness. Yet omens were not only for kings. The calendar itself, the rhythm of months, festivals, and planting seasons, was tied to astronomical observation. The new month began with the sighting of the crescent moon, a duty entrusted to temple officials. Priests watched the horizon each evening, scanning for the first sliver of light. When it appeared, the new month was proclaimed, and with it came a cycle of rituals, offerings, and civic obligations. The catalogues helped stabilize these declarations, ensuring that the pattern of months aligned with the observed heavens. This connection between sky and society made astronomy part of ordinary life, even for those who never read a tablet. A farmer might not know the details of Enuma, Anu, and Lil, but he knew that his planting season depended on lunar months. A merchant might not study Venus, but he knew that festivals determined when markets gathered. The priestly interpretations of the sky filtered into the routines of laborers, bakers, and traders. The boredom of cataloging stars became in its way the backbone of Babylonian order. Still, the weight of responsibility rested with the priests. Their role was not easy. A single eclipse could stir fear across the land. If they erred in their interpretation, if they failed to appease the gods, disaster could be blamed on them. To guard against this, priests leaned heavily on tradition. They rarely claimed personal insight. Instead, they cited precedent pointing to the tablets. This is what has always been observed, they might say, shifting the burden from themselves to the accumulated weight of history. The catalog was their shield, its monotony, their protection. What is striking from a modern perspective is how much depended on signs that were often ambiguous. A star rising early or late might be barely perceptible to the naked eye, yet its interpretation could alter a king's decision. The uncertainty of the sky bred a dependence on writing, and the dependence on writing created libraries, and the libraries created continuity. The whole system rested on the assumption that the gods spoke through repetition, that what happened in the sky before would happen again. But one cannot help but wonder, did the priests themselves believe fully in every omen they proclaimed? Or did some of them, in the quiet of their temple chambers, ever doubt whether the gods truly spoke through the endless patterns of stars that nobody else noticed? Section 2. Rituals, festivals, and the weight of prediction. To understand how Babylonian astronomy was used, one must picture a society where the line between the sacred and the practical was not sharply drawn. The heavens were not just a field of light, but a schedule of duties, a warning system, and a reassurance of divine order. Every eclipse, every appearance of a wandering planet, every lunar month carried weight. Priests did not simply record these events. They enacted them through rituals, proclamations, and ceremonies that touched the lives of everyone in the city. Take, for instance, the case of lunar eclipses. To the Babylonian mind, an eclipse was no ordinary event. When the moon was swallowed in shadow, it was read as a direct omen concerning the king. Darkness over the moon meant danger over the realm. To respond, priests carried out protective rituals. They recited prayers, burned incense, and sometimes appointed a temporary substitute king. This substitute, often a minor figure or a prisoner, sat on the throne for the duration of the bad omen, bearing the brunt of the predicted disaster. Once the danger had passed, the true king resumed his role, and the substitute was dismissed, often with grim finality. In this way, the catalogue of eclipses was not simply a list of dates, but a guidebook for survival. Calendrical observation was equally important, though less dramatic. Every new month began with the sighting of the crescent moon. Temple officials climbed rooftops or stood on city walls scanning the horizon for the faint curve of light. When it appeared, messengers proclaimed the new month, and the rhythm of civic life shifted accordingly. Markets opened, debts were calculated, festivals commenced. Without this careful synchronization of lunar months, trade, agriculture, and worship would fall into disarray. The star catalogs supported these proclamations by recording when the moon should appear, helping to correct mistakes when the sky was cloudy or the crescent faint. Festivals themselves were woven tightly into the system. The Great Akitu Festival, held in Babylon at the spring equinox, celebrated the renewal of kingship and the triumph of order over chaos. Its timing depended on astronomical observation. Priests needed to know when the year turned, when the sun crossed its seasonal threshold. Smaller festivals, too, dotted the year, each requiring sacrifices, processions, or prayers aligned with celestial cycles. In this way, the sky dictated the liturgy, and the tablets provided the scaffolding. The ordinary Babylonian felt this influence indirectly. A farmer might rise at dawn to plow his field, not because he had tracked Venus, but because the priests had announced that the month of planting had begun. A merchant might travel to a distant market, not because he understood the path of the moon, but because the festival date had been declared. The priest's astronomy, filtered through omens and calendars, regulated the invisible threads of social time. Yet beneath this practical framework, anxiety always lingered. The heavens were vast, and the messages they sent were not always clear. An unexpected comet could throw predictions into confusion. The delay of a star's rising might be ambiguous. Was it a bad omen, or just the haze of dust on the horizon? Priests turned to their catalogs for guidance, but even the tablets could not erase uncertainty. Each entry was a precedent, but precedents could conflict. One eclipse recorded in the Omen series might foretell famine, another invasion, another the death of a ruler. Which interpretation was correct? The weight of decision often fell on the priests themselves, who had to choose the reading that best suited the moment. This tension reveals something of the Babylonian mindset. Knowledge was not a way of mastering the world, but of navigating its dangers. The star catalogs and omen series did not eliminate uncertainty. They organized it. They gave shape to fear, turned randomness into categories, and allowed action to be taken. Rituals performed, festivals, declared, substitutes appointed. Whether or not the predictions always proved true was secondary. What mattered was that the system provided a sense of order in a world where floods, droughts, and invasions could come without warning. Still, one can imagine the burden that came with this role. A priest declaring the meaning of an eclipse carried not only the weight of tradition, but also the fate of his community. A wrong word could spark panic or embolden a reckless king. A delay in sighting the moon could disrupt markets or festivals. The clay tablets gave guidance, but the responsibility was human. And so we are left with a quiet question. Did the Babylonians truly believe the heavens spoke with perfect clarity? Or did they cling to the catalogs because the alternative, admitting uncertainty, was unthinkable? Section 3, Continuity Legacy, and the quiet power of ritual time. When you step back and consider the role of astronomy in Babylonian society, what emerges is not a tale of dramatic discoveries, but of continuity. The priests did not gaze at the stars in pursuit of abstract truths. They watched because the heavens were bound to their duties to read omens for kings, to set calendars for cities, to ensure rituals were performed at their appointed times. Their catalogs of stars, their records of eclipses, their observations of planets were all tools for maintaining order. Order was fragile in Mesopotamia. Floods could devastate fields. Droughts could paralyze trade. Foreign armies could descend with little warning. Against this backdrop of uncertainty, the predictable cycles of the sky offered reassurance. The rising of the moon, the return of Venus, the passage of the sun through its seasons all gave a sense of structure. By embedding these patterns into ritual, the Babylonians transformed the heavens into a stabilizing framework for human life. The calendar became not just a schedule, but a safeguard against chaos. The endurance of this system is striking. For centuries, lunar months dictated Babylonian life. The omen series Enuma, Anu, and Lil was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, each new scribe adding to a tradition that seemed timeless. Priests, in later centuries, still recited interpretations drawn from tablets composed long before their birth. Even as dynasties changed, as Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians ruled the same lands, the stars were read in the same ways, their meanings anchored by precedent. Continuity was the ultimate form of authority. This continuity left an enduring legacy. When Greek scholars encountered Mesopotamian astronomy in the centuries after Alexander the Great's conquest, they inherited not only numerical data, but also the concept that celestial cycles could structure human time. The Babylonian lunar calendar, with its intercalated months to keep pace with the solar year, influenced later Hellenistic and Jewish calendars. Even the 7-day week linked to the visible planets has roots in Mesopotamian practice. What began as a series of temple proclamations about the new moon became in time part of the architecture of global timekeeping. Yet the heart of Babylonian astronomy was never scientific in the modern sense. It was religious, ritualistic, and profoundly human. The priests did not care whether an eclipse was caused by the shadow of the earth. They cared that it signaled danger to the king. They did not ask whether Venus shone by reflecting sunlight. They asked whether its appearance meant war or peace. Their system was not about explanation, but about survival, not about universal law, but about immediate meaning. In this, their work carries a quiet lesson. Much of what sustains societies is not the spectacular, but the repetitive. The sighting of the moon each month, the proclamation of festivals, the chanting of omens, all were rituals of maintenance. They did not change the world dramatically, but they kept it steady. The Babylonians catalogued stars no one else watched, read omens most people never questioned, and in doing so provided the rhythm by which a civilization endured. Today, when we glance at the calendar on our screens, we rarely think of its ancient roots. Yet the structure of months, weeks, and years owes something to those early priests scanning the horizon for a crescent moon. Their boredom became our inheritance. Their insistence on repetition created a continuity that still shapes how we measure time. And so we are left with a final reflection. Perhaps what matters most in history is not the brilliance of invention, but the persistence of routine. The Babylonians in their temples did not aim to change the future. They aimed to preserve the present, to hold chaos at bay with catalogs and rituals. But in preserving, they created a legacy. The question then lingers quietly, which of our own routines, so dull, so ordinary to us now, will echo across millennia, as theirs have story 4, from Babylon to Greece. How Forgotten Numbers Shaped Western Astronomy, Section 1, Conquest, Contact, and the Flow of Knowledge. When Alexander the Great marched into Mesopotamia in the 4th century BCE, he was not thinking of stars. His mind was on empire, on defeating the Persian king Darius, on claiming Babylon as a jewel of conquest, on pushing ever eastward toward India. Yet in his wake, something more subtle than military victory occurred. Alongside soldiers and administrators came scholars, merchants, and translators. In the mingling of Greek and Mesopotamian worlds, a transmission of knowledge began, one that would quietly alter the course of astronomy. Babylon by then was already ancient. Its libraries and temple archives contained centuries of observations, clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform filled with lists of stars, records of eclipses, and long series of planetary appearances. These records, dull in their repetition, were the product of countless scribes who had pressed wedges into clay in service of priests and kings. For the Greeks, whose intellectual tradition prized explanation and theory, such materials offered something different: raw data. The Greeks had long been fascinated by the heavens. Philosophers like Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle speculated about the nature of the cosmos, imagining perfect spheres and unchanging celestial motions. Yet their theories often lacked the weight of observation. They proposed models, but without centuries of records, it was difficult to test them. When they encountered Babylonian astronomy, they discovered a treasure trove of numbers, precise dates of eclipses, systematic records of Venus, and predictions of lunar cycles that stretched across centuries. What had been routine in Babylon became revelation in Greece. The process of transmission was not instantaneous. Cuneiform was a difficult script, and few Greeks could read it. Instead, knowledge flowed through intermediaries. Under the Seleucid Empire, which inherited much of Alexander's territory, Greek and Babylonian scholars sometimes worked side by side. Greek rulers supported local temples, and Babylonian scribes continued their work now within a Hellenistic framework. In this cultural overlap, fragments of Babylonian astronomy were translated into Greek, sometimes directly, sometimes through oral teaching. What struck the Greeks most was the predictive power of Babylonian methods. By observing cycles, Babylonian scribes could anticipate eclipses with reasonable accuracy. They did not explain why eclipses occurred, but they knew when they would. Greek thinkers inheriting this data sought to explain the underlying causes. Where the Babylonians saw omens, the Greeks sought mechanisms. The blend of the two traditions, Babylonian accumulation and Greek theorizing, created a new astronomy, one that combined data with models. Consider the case of Hipparchus, a Greek astronomer of the 2nd century BCE. He is credited with discovering the precession of the equinoxes, the slow shift of the stars over time. Yet his insight depended on comparing his own observations with much older Babylonian records. Without those centuries of dull star lists, he could not have noticed the gradual drift. What was to the Babylonians a catalog became to Hipparchus a discovery. In this way, the boring numbers of Mesopotamian scribes became fuel for Greek breakthroughs. But transmission was never perfect. Much was lost. Only fragments of Babylonian astronomy reached Greece, and much of it was filtered through translation and reinterpretation. The Greeks did not inherit the full religious and ritual context of the tablets. They took the numbers, but not the omens. The gods faded from the data, and what remained was a foundation for geometry and cosmology. In this transformation, Babylonian work became both less and more than it had been. It lost its immediate meaning, but gained a new role as scaffolding for scientific thought. The story of this exchange is a reminder that history often moves through unlikely channels. Alexander's conquest brought destruction as well as connection. Temples were damaged, traditions disrupted, archives scattered. Yet amid the upheaval, clay tablets survived, scribes continued their routines, and Greek curiosity found in them something useful. The meeting of cultures born of war produced continuity and knowledge. Still, one wonders, did the Babylonian scribes, laboring in their final centuries of cuneiform, realize that their work was being absorbed into a foreign system? Did they see themselves as guardians of an ancient tradition, or as contributors to something new that they could not fully imagine? Section 2. Numbers into geometry, omens into models. The strength of Babylonian astronomy lay in its records. The strength of Greek astronomy lay in its theories. When the two encountered one another, they created a new form of knowledge, though not without distortion. To the Babylonians, the stars were signs. To the Greeks, they were part of a cosmos whose order could be explained. What one culture recorded without question, the other sought to fit into elegant patterns. Babylonian scribes had worked with cycles. They tracked the motions of Venus, noting its appearances in the morning and evening sky. And after years of data, they identified periods of repetition, 8 years for Venus, 18 years for eclipses. These cycles allowed them to predict when similar events would occur again. Their mathematics was practical, based on their sexagesimal system, rich in tables and algorithms, but with little concern for geometry. A Babylonian scribe could tell you when the next eclipse would come, but not why. Greek thinkers approached the heavens differently. They imagined the cosmos as a system of spheres, with planets moving in circles around the Earth. To them, the heavens had to be not only predictable, but also rational, symmetrical, and beautiful. When they encountered Babylonian data, they saw not lists of omens, but measurements waiting to be explained. The cycles of Venus were no longer signs from the gods, but patterns in need of geometric models. It was in this blending that figures like Hipparchus and later Ptolemy thrived. Hipparchus compared his observations with Babylonian eclipse records spanning centuries and realized that the stars themselves were shifting slowly, a phenomenon he called the precession of the equinoxes. Ptolemy, working in Alexandria centuries later, relied heavily on Babylonian numerical periods to build the Almagest, his monumental synthesis of Greek astronomy. The numbers gave precision to theories that otherwise risked floating free of reality. Yet in this transformation, much of the original meaning was lost. The Babylonians had cataloged stars for religious reasons, embedding each observation in a web of omen literature. An eclipse was never just an eclipse. It was a warning, a verdict from the gods. By the time the data reached Greek hands, these associations had largely disappeared. What remained were the cycles stripped of their spiritual weight. The heavens had shifted from a divine text to a mathematical puzzle. This shift was not absolute. Some Greeks still spoke of omens. Astrology flourished in the Hellenistic world, borrowing heavily from Mesopotamian precedent. The division of the zodiac into 12 signs, the linking of planets to human fate, all had roots in Babylonian tradition. But even here, the framing changed. Where Babylonians emphasized precedent, this happened before, so it will happen again, Greeks increasingly emphasized system planets influencing character stars, shaping destiny through rational correspondences. The Babylonian habit of copying became the Greek habit of theorizing. The consequences of this transformation were immense. For the first time, astronomy moved beyond observation into explanation. Babylonian scribes had assembled centuries of data, but never sought to model the universe as a whole. Greek philosophers had speculated on cosmic order, but lacked the long baseline of evidence. Together they produced a hybrid tradition, observationally grounded, theoretically ambitious. It was not modern science, but it was a crucial step toward it. Still, one cannot help but reflect on the irony. For the Babylonians, the stars were alive with divine speech. For the Greeks, they became abstractions in circles and epicycles. The same records that once guided rituals and festivals now fueled geometric diagrams. The dull repetition of clay tablets copied endlessly by anonymous scribes became the scaffolding for a new intellectual edifice. Their boring numbers became the seed of Western astronomy. But in this blending, a question lingers: did the transformation enrich the tradition, or did it strip it of something essential? By turning omens into models, did the Greeks preserve the Babylonians' achievement, or did they silence the very worldview that had sustained it? Section 3. Endurance Beyond Empires. When the Greek world absorbed Babylonian astronomy, it did more than borrow a few numbers. It inherited a tradition of patience. The scribes of Mesopotamia, with their reed styluses and stacks of clay tablets, had spent centuries copying data without concern for theory. The philosophers of Greece, with their love of geometry and their pursuit of rational order, seized that data and transformed it into models. Together, these two tendencies, recording and explaining, formed a foundation that would shape astronomy for nearly 2,000 years. The clearest embodiment of this synthesis was Ptolemy's Almagest, composed in the 2nd century CE. This vast treatise, written in Greek but drawing upon Babylonian periods, became the authoritative text of astronomy for the medieval world. It contained geometric models for planetary motion, but its numerical foundations often reached back to Mesopotamian observations. Ptolemy's careful charts of eclipses, his tables of planetary cycles, his reliance on sexagesimal fractions, all bore the imprint of Babylonian tradition, even if few readers recognized it. What had once been copied by temple scribes for omens was now studied in libraries across the Mediterranean as part of a scientific canon. The endurance of these ideas was remarkable. Long after Babylon itself had declined, long after cuneiform had ceased to be written, the patterns first noted in clay lived on in parchment and paper. Islamic scholars in Baghdad, centuries later, translated and expanded Ptolemy's work, refining the astronomical tables. Medieval European scholars, in turn, received these translations, still carrying traces of Babylonian cycles, beneath layers of Greek and Arabic commentary. The chain of transmission stretched across empires, languages, and religions, linking anonymous scribes of the 2nd millennium BCE to astronomers of the Renaissance. It is worth remembering, though, how accidental this endurance was. The Babylonian scribes did not write for Greece, nor for Rome, nor for us. They wrote for their temples, their kings, their gods. The Greeks, in turn, reinterpreted their work for their own purposes, stripping away omens and adding geometry. Each stage transformed the material, often obscuring its origins. By the time Kepler or Copernicus looked back on ancient astronomy, the Babylonian contribution was hidden beneath centuries of reinterpretation. Only modern archaeology, uncovering cuneiform tablets, revealed how much the Greeks owed to their Mesopotamian predecessors. The legacy, then, is double. On one hand, Babylonian astronomy was preserved, reshaped into a tradition that underpinned Western science. On the other, it was forgotten its scribes, left nameless, their intentions misunderstood. The stars they cataloged to hear the gods became stars used to measure ellipses and orbits. Their boredom became someone else's brilliance. There is something quietly humbling in this. The grandeur of Greek philosophy, the enduring influence of the Almagest, the triumphs of modern science, all rest in part on the dull work of Mesopotamian scribes, who never dreamed their lists would matter beyond their temples. It reminds us that knowledge often survives, not through spectacular insight, but through unglamorous diligence. As you reflect on this chain of transmission from Babylonian clay to Greek geometry, from Greek scrolls to Islamic manuscripts, from there to European print, you might ask, what of our own records? Our own data will endure beyond us. Will the vast numbers we collect today, often unnoticed and uncelebrated one day, serve as the scaffolding for discoveries far beyond our imagination? Story 5. Farmers' Floods and Forgotten Moons. Practical life behind the observations. Section 1. The river, the field, and the sky. If you were an ordinary Babylonian, you did not need to know the names of distant constellations or the details of planetary cycles. Your life was closer to the earth, bound to the soil of the floodplain, to the irrigation ditches that fed your fields, to the rhythm of sowing and harvest. Yet above you, the same sky that priests studied for omens offered another kind of guidance, the calendar of survival. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was fertile, but it was never easy. Each year, the rivers rose and fell, sometimes flooding too much, sometimes too little. Rainfall was scarce, so irrigation was essential. Fields of barley, the staple crop, demanded careful timing. Plant too early, and seedlings risked withering in the dry heat. Plant too late, and the river might flood before the harvest. The difference between abundance and famine could rest on a few weeks' miscalculation. Here, astronomy met agriculture. The sighting of the new moon, the observation of seasonal stars, the return of certain constellations, all helped mark the passage of time. Priests declared the start of months, but the farmer felt their weight in his furrows. A waxing crescent meant that a new cycle of labor was beginning: ditches to be cleared, fields to be plowed, seed to be sown. A full moon gave light for working late into the night during harvest. The stars, cataloged on tablets in dusty storerooms, became in their way the invisible clock of the countryside. It is striking to consider how indirect this connection was. A farmer in his field probably never saw a star tablet. He may not even have understood the full system of lunar months. What he knew was that the temple announced the timing of festivals and obligations, and these announcements aligned with the work of the land. The priest's observations translated into the farmer's routine. The boredom of catalogs far removed from plowing and sowing shaped the cadence of his year. Floods were another constant concern. The Euphrates might rise suddenly, threatening fields and villages. Priests and officials tried to anticipate these shifts, not always with success. Some astronomical cycles were linked, rightly or wrongly, to the behavior of the rivers. An eclipse, a strange position of Venus, or the appearance of an unfamiliar star, could be taken as warnings of floods. The catalogue of omens and observations thus served as a kind of environmental record part, superstition part practical memory. In this way, the lives of farmers and priests overlapped, though rarely directly. One gazed at the sky, the other at the soil, yet both depended on each other. The farmer's harvest was needed to feed the temples. The temple's calendar was needed to guide the farmer. Between them lay the clay tablets filled with dull but enduring notes about moons and stars. Daily life was structured around these cycles. A farmer rose at dawn, worked in the fields, returned home to eat bread and stew with his family, and perhaps offered prayers at a small household shrine. The greater rituals of the city, festivals, sacrifices, processions, interrupted this rhythm only occasionally. Yet, behind the scenes, the entire structure of timekeeping that framed his life was anchored in the heavens. He did not need to catalog the stars himself. Others had done it for him. This raises a curious thought. For the priests, the heavens were a divine text. For the farmer, they were a practical clock. Did either group fully realize how much they relied on the other? Did the scribe, pressing his stylus into clay by lamplight, think of the farmer bending over his barley by the river? Or did each inhabit his own world, joined only by the silent rhythms of moons and stars? Section 2. Irrigation labor and the calendar of survival, life, in Mesopotamia, was shaped not by stars in themselves, but by water. The twin rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, made farming possible, yet they also threatened it. Without irrigation canals, the land would dry and crack. Without embankments, sudden floods could sweep away fields. Managing water was as constant a task as sowing seed, and it required timing. That timing, in turn, was tied to the heavens. Each year, canals were cleared of silt, their banks repaired, their gates opened and closed according to the season. These labors had to be coordinated. Temple officials, acting with the authority of astronomical timekeeping, declared when communities should gather for canal work. Farmers could not delay. Irrigation was a collective effort. The priest's announcement of a new month was not just a ritual, it was also a command. Now is the time to begin. The cycle of moons structured the cycle of ditches. The farmer's survival depended on these schedules. Barley needed planting at the right time, not too early, not too late. Date palms, an essential crop of the region, also required careful tending their fruits, harvested at predictable intervals. Livestock had to be driven to pastures at particular seasons, avoiding the worst floods or droughts. Each task fell into a rhythm, and behind that rhythm stood the temple calendar itself, supported by centuries of star catalogs. Food was the immediate concern, but food was also obligation. Farmers paid portions of their harvest in tax to temple and palace. These payments were calculated by the month due at appointed times. Grain deliveries counted in measures lined up with lunar cycles. A delay in declaring the month could ripple outward tax, delayed storage, disrupted debts, unsettled. In this way, even the humblest field laborer felt the weight of astronomical precision, though he might never have realized its source. Daily meals reflected this dependence. A Babylonian family ate barley bread, sometimes flavored with onions or dates, often accompanied by beer, brewed from barley as well. Meat was rare, usually reserved for festivals or special occasions. Most days the diet was simple, bread stew and beer. But whether a family ate well or poorly depended on whether the planting had been timed correctly, the irrigation managed properly, the flood predicted accurately. Astronomy, far removed from the household table, nonetheless, decided what ended up in the pot. The connection between the farmer's field and the priest's tablet was fragile. A miscalculation could bring ruin. Too much water at the wrong time could drown crops. Too little could leave them stunted. A delay in planting a poorly coordinated canal clearing, an unexpected flood, any of these could undo months of labor. And while farmers bore the consequences, priests held the authority. The sky's cycles recorded in clay gave legitimacy to decisions whose practical outcomes were sometimes uncertain. Yet, the system endured. For centuries, generations of farmers followed the rhythms declared from temples, trusting in the moons and stars, adjusting when needed, but never discarding the structure. It was a form of collective faith, faith in the rivers and the priests, in the silent heavens. And perhaps it was also a form of resignation. What choice did the farmer have but to accept the timing laid down by those who read the sky still? There is a quiet question in this arrangement. Did the farmer, weary from canal work and anxious about his harvest, ever resent the stars that governed his life without his consent? Or did he see in their rhythms a kind of comfort, a reminder that though unpredictable, the world still moved according to patterns older than himself? Section 3. Continuity in the fields, echoes in the stars, if temples and scribes preserve the heavens in clay. It was the fields that gave their work meaning. For the farmer, astronomy was invisible, but essential, woven into the pulse of survival. The sighting of a crescent moon might not seem like much, but its proclamation began a chain of obligations canals, to clear seeds, to scatter taxes, to pay offerings to prepare. The catalogue of stars, far removed from muddy furrows, became the hidden skeleton of everyday life. The cycle was relentless. A farmer rose with the sun, worked until heat drove him back into shade, and returned at dusk to his family. Festivals broke the monotony, their timing determined by astronomical reckoning. A harvest might be celebrated with processions, music, and shared feasting, but behind the joy lay the anxiety of whether the next cycle would be as kind. Each year was a gamble, and each gamble was measured against the heavens. Floods brought both fear and hope. When the Euphrates swelled, it threatened to erase labor, yet it also carried the silt that made fields fertile. Priests might declare the flood's timing as linked to celestial signs and eclipse here, a planetary alignment there. Whether or not these predictions were accurate, they gave shape to uncertainty. To attribute the river's rise to the heavens was to embed it, in order to believe that chaos was never fully random. The catalogue of stars thus doubled as a catalogue of trust, however fragile. The farmer's dependence on the temple calendar also revealed the intertwining of the sacred and the mundane. Planting was not merely an economic act. It was framed as a ritual act aligned with the will of the gods as revealed in the sky. To sow barley was to cooperate with divine order, to join one's labor with the cosmic cycles that the scribes so carefully recorded. Even if the farmer muttered about canal work or cursed the flood, he still lived within a worldview where agriculture was never just agriculture. It was a reflection of the heavens. This system endured not because it was perfect, but because it was consistent. Mistakes were made. Floods still came. Harvests still failed. But the framework of months' festivals and predictions persisted generation after generation. In this way, Babylonian society absorbed uncertainty by embedding it in ritual, by repeating the same cycles, by following the same calendars, They gave stability to a life that was anything but stable. The boredom of repetition became paradoxically the anchor of resilience. Looking back, what is striking is not the drama of Babylonian agriculture, but its persistence. The farmer bent over his field was not trying to change the world. He was trying to endure it. The priest recording the moon was not seeking discovery. He was seeking order. Yet together, they created a rhythm that lasted for centuries, shaping not only Mesopotamian life, but also the very structure of timekeeping that reached into later cultures. Today, we no longer plant barley by the sighting of the crescent moon, nor do we interpret floods as omens of divine favor. Yet our own dependence on calendars, forecasts, and routines is not so far removed. The quiet systems we rely upon, often unnoticed, often dull, carry the same weight of survival. The Babylonians remind us that boredom and necessity are often twins, and that what feels ordinary can shape civilizations. And so we might end with a reflection: the farmer looking at his furrows, and the priest looking at his tablets were bound by the same sky. Neither controlled it, but both depended on it. Perhaps the question that lingers is this: in our own age, what hidden rhythms do we follow without noticing, and which forgotten details of our lives will one day be seen as the backbone of history? Story 6. Scribal Schools and Silent Students. The Bureaucracy of the Stars, Section 1. Learning to write the sky, the legacy of Babylonian astronomy did not rest only on the brilliance of seasoned priests or the dedication of senior scribes. It also rested on the silent labor of students, boys trained in the art of writing, who filled their tablets with practice lines long before they touched the heavens. In dusty rooms near temple courtyards under the watchful eye of instructors, these students learned to shape clay into tablets, to hold the reed stylus, and to press wedges into patterns that would eventually become the words of the gods, the names of stars, and the numbers of cycles. Scribal education began early. A boy from a family with means, or one chosen for temple service, entered the aduba, the tablet house. Here, discipline was strict and repetition constant. The first lessons were simple. Write the same sign over and over, copy a list of words, memorize standard phrases. The tablet house was noisy with the sound of styluses, tapping clay, with students muttering lines aloud as they copied them. Errors were corrected with harsh rebukes, sometimes with blows. Learning was not gentle, but it was thorough. Astronomical texts did not appear until much later in the curriculum. A beginner first mastered legal formulas, hymns, and lexical lists. Only advanced students encountered omen series and star catalogs. To copy the 3 stars. Each text to memorize the divisions of the sky into the paths of Anu and Lil and Ea was a privilege of the most capable. By then, the student's hand was steady, his memory trained, his endurance proven. Astronomy was not taught as a separate science. It was folded into the larger scribal tradition, another category of knowledge preserved through copying. The work itself was monotonous. A student might spend hours reproducing the same passage, not for discovery, but for practice. The names of constellations became exercises in penmanship, their meanings secondary to the neatness of the wedges. Numbers, marking lunar months, doubled as arithmetic drills. In this way, astronomical catalogs were preserved, not because they were studied for their content, but because they were useful for training the next generation of scribes. Knowledge endured through boredom. Yet behind this monotony, there was structure. The bureaucracy of Babylon demanded endless records, contracts, receipts, tax accounts, inventories. The habit of copying made the scribal class the guardians of stability. Star catalogs fit naturally into this world. They were not thrilling revelations, but another set of lists to be maintained, another text to be memorized. Just as a student learned to record the delivery of grain, he learned to record the rising of a star. Both were part of the same worldview. Everything must be written. Everything must be preserved. The student's life was difficult. Days were long lessons, harsh mistakes punished. Yet those who endured gained entry into a respected class. Scribes were not warriors, but they held power through their pens. They shaped memory, recorded law, preserved ritual, and defined time itself. Even if a student never gazed at the stars in earnest, by copying their catalogs, he became part of the machinery that ensured the heavens were never forgotten. And so we return to the quiet scene. A boy bent over clay, pressing wedges again and again, weary from repetition. He does not yet know that his work will outlast him by millennia, that his exercises will one day be studied in museums. For him, it is only a lesson, only a demand of the tablet house. But for us, it is the foundation of continuity. Still, one wonders, did the students weary of endless copying ever realize that their boredom was shaping history? Or did they see only the clay beneath their hands, never glimpsing the stars, their tablets preserved? Section 2. The machinery of copying and the weight of tradition. The Babylonian scribal schools were not isolated classrooms. They were part of a larger network of institutions that depended on the steady production of writing. Temples, palaces, and courts all required records, contracts, tax accounts, lists of offerings, hymns for rituals. Into the system, astronomical texts fit with ease. To the scribes, a star catalog was no different in function than a grain register. Both were lists, both were copied, both carried authority because they were written. This attitude shaped the way knowledge was preserved. A scribal student who graduated into temple service often spent his days not in observation, but in administration. He recorded deliveries of barley-tallied labor obligations and sealed contracts with his stylus. Astronomy was just one of many categories of text that flowed across his tablet. The same skills that allowed him to calculate quantities of grain also allowed him to copy lunar cycles. Writing was the skill. The content was secondary. Yet the act of copying astronomical texts carried particular weight. Star catalogs were not merely bureaucratic, but sacred. To the Babylonian worldview, the heavens were the language of the gods, and recording them was a ritual in itself. Even if a scribe did not personally believe every omen, the act of preservation affirmed continuity. Each line of cuneiform was not only a note about the sky, but also a gesture of loyalty to tradition, to the temple, to the gods who had set the stars in place. This weight of tradition was heavy. Scribes were expected to copy faithfully, not creatively. Innovation was rare, even discouraged. When contradictions appeared in the tablets, when one text said an eclipse meant famine, and another said it meant invasion, the scribe preserved both. To remove or alter would be to risk breaking the chain of transmission. Redundancy was safer than revision. And so the catalogs grew, filled with repetitions, variations, and fragments of older systems long outdated. The bureaucracy of the stars, like all bureaucracies, valued continuity over clarity. Libraries grew from this impulse. Temple storerooms and palace archives collected astronomical texts alongside law codes, omen series, and hymns. Each generation of scribes added new copies, replacing broken tablets, repairing gaps, updating with new observations, but rarely discarding the old. In this way, Babylonian astronomy became less a science then a sediment layers of texts piling up over centuries, each generation adding its layer of clay to the archive. The effect was paradoxical. On one hand, this bureaucracy ensured survival. Without it, the records of Venus, the lists of constellations, the predictions of eclipses would never have reached us. On the other hand, it created a tradition so dense that meaning could be obscured. Even in their own time, priests must have struggled to navigate the weight of accumulated material. The tablets contained everything, but everything was overwhelming. The endurance of the scribal system owed less to the brilliance of individuals than to the discipline of institutions. The tablet house trained students, the temple employed scribes, the palace relied on their authority, and the cycle continued. No single scribe imagined himself as shaping history. He was fulfilling a role, performing a duty, keeping alive a tradition that demanded no less. And yet history was shaped all the same. What seemed like endless copying became, in the long view, the preservation of the first systematic astronomical tradition in human history. The bureaucracy of the stars, boring in its repetition, became the foundation upon which later cultures built their own sciences. Still, one must ask, did the scribes, surrounded by stacks of tablets, ever feel crushed by the very tradition they served? Did they sense that in preserving everything they risked losing clarity? Or did they find comfort in the weight of continuity, trusting that the act of writing itself was enough, even if the meaning was lost? Section 3. Silent preservation and the afterlife of learning. The story of Babylonian astronomy is not the story of sudden brilliance. It is the story of endurance of classrooms, filled with students muttering lines under their breath of styluses, tapping clay in unison of libraries, growing heavier with each generation. It is the story of scribes, who copied what they did not question, who preserved what they did not invent, who kept alive a tradition that to them was duty rather than discovery. In the scribal schools, repetition was everything. A boy might spend days pressing the same sign, weeks copying the same passage, years reproducing omen lists. His work was rarely original, but it bound him into a chain of continuity. By the time he copied a star catalog, he was not creating something new, but extending something ancient. His wedges joined those of countless others, stretching back centuries. He was not an author, but a link. This anonymity was deliberate. Unlike poets who sought glory, or kings who stamped their names on monuments, scribes rarely left signatures. A few tablets bear colophons naming their writers, but most are silent. The preservation of the tradition mattered more than the preservation of the individual. The bureaucracy of the stars required many hands, but no egos. Each student, each scribe was replaceable. What mattered was that the cycle continued. And continue it did. Even as empires fell, Akkadian, to Babylonian, Babylonian, to Assyrian, Assyrian to Persian, the scribal schools endured. The scripts changed slightly, the dialects shifted. The political rulers came and went, but the clay tablets kept accumulating. Astronomy was copied in times of prosperity and in times of decline, a steady heartbeat of tradition beneath the turbulence of history. The persistence of boring labor became a form of resistance to chaos. The survival of these tablets into our own time is testament to this bureaucracy. Without the students who copied endlessly, without the schools that demanded accuracy, without the institutional weight that valued repetition, the records would not exist. What museums now display, what scholars now decipher, is not the product of genius, but of boredom, elevated into duty. The Babylonians trusted not in flashes of insight, but in the long grind of continuity. This has left us with a paradox. We know more about the stars of ancient Babylon than we do about many of its people, its songs, its daily conversations. The bureaucracy preserved astronomy with a diligence it did not extend to everything else. We owe our knowledge of their heavens to their insistence on copying, even when the meaning was obscure, even when the content seemed dull. In their silence, the students and scribes shaped what history remembers. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the tablet house. History is often built not by those who seek to be remembered, but by those who do their work unseen. The silent student, punished for a crooked wedge, contributed as much to the endurance of astronomy as the priest who interpreted omens for kings. Their boredom became our knowledge. As we reflect on this, we might ask in our own bureaucracies of data and information, what is being silently preserved? Which routines, copied without thought, will survive long after the voices of individuals are gone? And when future generations piece together fragments of our age, will they find, as we have with Babylon, that boredom was the truest guardian of memory? Story 7. Copying mistakes and dusty libraries. Why ancient data survived Section 1: Fragile clay and human error. When you imagine the Babylonian star catalogues, it is easy to think of them as precise, orderly, and unbroken. Yet the reality was far messier. The clay tablets that carried the heavens were fragile things, easily cracked, lost, or miscopied. The scribes who copied them were diligent, but they were also human, and humans make mistakes. In those mistakes, in those accidents of preservation, lies part of the reason why the tradition endured. Clay itself was never a perfect medium. Soft when wet, it hardened unevenly, and over time it crumbled. A dropped tablet could split. A damp storeroom could dissolve whole shelves. Fires, which destroyed wooden buildings, often baked tablets, harder preserving them. But even then, fragments were scattered. No Babylonian library was ever complete for long. Every collection bore the marks of loss. Within this material fragility, scribes worked endlessly to replace what was missing. Copying was not only education, but repair. A damaged tablet might be recopied from memory, or reconstructed from older versions. In the process, errors crept in, a number miswritten, a line skipped, a name replaced. Later scribes, reluctant to discard any version, often preserved both. What might seem to us like contradictions, two different dates for the same eclipse, two different omens for the same star, were often the product of this copying process. These mistakes tell us something about Babylonian priorities. They valued continuity over consistency. To remove an error was to risk losing a tradition. To preserve both versions was safer. Their libraries, therefore, were not clean archives, but living accumulations, filled with overlaps, redundancies, and contradictions. Each mistake became part of the tradition itself, fossilized in clay. For modern historians, this has created a puzzle. Reconstructing Babylonian astronomy means navigating layers of error and correction. A single text might exist in 3 or 4 versions, each slightly different. But it also means that more survived than might have otherwise, because scribes were unwilling to discard, because they tolerated duplication. Fragments of knowledge survived that would have vanished in a culture more obsessed with clarity. Dust was another enemy and another preserver. Libraries of clay tablets, stacked on shelves, gathered dirt, and were often left neglected. Some collections were buried by accident, abandoned when cities fell. Others were deliberately stored and forgotten. To the people who left them behind, these libraries may have seemed like clutter, irrelevant remnants of older generations. To archaeologists, thousands of years later, they were treasure. What was once dust became archive. It is humbling to realize how fragile this chain was. At every stage, knowledge could have been lost. A flood could wash away a storeroom. A conqueror could burn a temple. A careless student could miscopy a crucial number. Yet somehow, through this fragility, the record survived, not intact, not perfect, but sufficient to carry the tradition forward. And so, in the cracks of tablets and the errors of scribes, we glimpse the paradox of Babylonian astronomy. It endured not because it was flawless, but because it was resilient. What mattered was not perfection, but persistence. Still, we are left with a question. Did the scribes, aware of their own mistakes, ever worry that the heavens they recorded were slipping away? Or did they trust that even in error, the act of writing was enough to preserve the stars for those who came after Section 2? Libraries, loss, and the accidents of preservation. The Babylonian world was full of libraries, though they did not look like the ones we imagine today. There were no shelves lined with books, no neat rows of parchment. Instead, there were storerooms filled with clay tablets, stacked in baskets or jars arranged in boxes, sometimes shelved on wooden racks. The library was as much an archive as a collection serving priests, scribes, and students who needed access to old texts. Within these spaces, astronomical tablets lay alongside omen series, hymns, contracts, and medical recipes, everything written preserved together in clay. The most famous ancient library, that of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, though Assyrian rather than Babylonian, gives us a sense of what these collections looked like. Thousands of tablets were gathered under royal command, copied from older sources and stored together. When Nineveh was destroyed by fire in 612 BCE, the flames hardened the clay, baking it into near permanence. The catastrophe that ended the Assyrian Empire accidentally preserved its knowledge. In a similar way, Babylonian libraries endured through destruction, their contents often surviving precisely because cities collapsed. But preservation was never complete. Each conquest scattered texts. Some tablets were lost in rubble, others looted and reused. Clay was sturdy, but it was not sacred. An old tablet might be discarded if it seemed irrelevant or recycled into building material. The survival of astronomy was thus uneven. Certain series like Enuma, Anu, and Lil, or the Three Stars, each list were copied so often that multiple versions endured. Others, more obscure, vanished entirely. What we now reconstruct is as much a story of chance as of design. The copying process itself was another form of preservation. A library could be destroyed, but if even one student had made a copy elsewhere, the tradition continued. Over centuries, texts migrated, replicated across temples, carried into new cities by scribes. This redundancy created resilience. No single archive was indispensable, because no single archive was unique. The very monotony of copying ensured that knowledge spread wide enough to outlast disaster. For modern historians, this patchwork survival is both gift and frustration. We hold fragments of texts, sometimes multiple copies of the same passage, sometimes broken lines that must be reconstructed like puzzles. One library may preserve half a catalog, another hundreds of miles away the missing half. Together, they form a mosaic, incomplete but recognizable. Without redundancy, without mistakes, without accidents of fire and burial, we would have nothing at all. This uneven preservation also reveals something about Babylonian values. They preserved what they thought mattered most, but often in ways that seem disproportionate to us. Entire omen series, vast and repetitive, survive in multiple copies, while poetry or narrative texts sometimes vanish almost entirely. The heavens mattered more than stories. Continuity of ritual mattered more than individual expression. What they chose to copy shaped what we now know. And so Babylonian astronomy endures not because it was invulnerable, but because it was scattered, repeated, and forgotten in ways that paradoxically preserved it. The libraries were fragile, but fragility combined with redundancy created endurance. Still, one must ask how much was lost forever, lying in ruins still buried, or dissolved in floods long past, and if so much has survived only by accident. How different might our picture of Babylonian astronomy be if the accidents had fallen another way? Section 3 fragments, memory and the shape of what remains. When you look at a Babylonian star tablet today, it rarely appears whole. More often it has cracked a corner, missing a line broken off. What survives is fragmentary. Scholars sit with magnifying glasses piecing together faint wedge marks, comparing them with other tablets, reconstructing what was once written. The tradition of Babylonian astronomy, that seems so vast in hindsight, is in fact a patchwork stitched from fragments. Its endurance is real, but its completeness is an illusion. This fragmentary survival was inevitable. Every stage of transmission introduced loss. A scribe copying a tablet might skip a line. A library destroyed in war might scatter its contents. A flood might dissolve entire shelves. What remains to us is the result of countless small chances. One fire-baked tablet's hard enough to last. Another flood washed them into mud. One student copied a list in full. Another abandoned his work halfway. The tradition endured not because it was invulnerable, but because enough fragments survived to be stitched back together. For the Babylonians themselves, the process must have felt different. They trusted in the act of copying and the authority of tradition. If a mistake slipped in, if a text was garbled, the continuity of writing still gave reassurance. To write was to preserve, even if what was preserved was imperfect. Their faith was not in accuracy, but in persistence. And in the long view, they were right. The survival of their astronomy proves that endurance sometimes matters more than precision. Modern scholars, however, are left with the gaps. We reconstruct cycles of Venus from incomplete lists. We compare contradictory omen texts. We guess at missing signs. The result is a body of knowledge that is both impressive and fragile, a mirror of its own history. Babylonian astronomy is not a neat record, but a broken mosaic, beautiful in its persistence, frustrating in its incompleteness. This incompleteness also shapes our picture of the past. We know much about eclipses because they were recorded obsessively, but little about constellations that may once have been familiar. We know the cycles of Venus and the Moon, but the personal reflections of the scribes are absent. What survived were the texts that institutions valued, the ones copied endlessly, even when dull. The voices of individuals, the doubts, the jokes, the casual remarks, all are gone. What remains is the bureaucracy of the heavens, stripped of the humanity that once sustained it. And yet, there is something quietly profound in this survival. We are separated from the Babylonians by thousands of years, by languages and empires, by worldviews, utterly different from our own. And still, we can read their numbers. We can trace their moons, their planets, their eclipses. We can see through their mistakes and their dust how carefully they preserved what mattered to them. In this way, the fragments become more than broken clay. They become bridges across time. Perhaps this is the final lesson of Babylonian astronomy, that history is always incomplete, always fragile, always shaped by chance. What we know is not everything, but enough. Enough to glimpse their patience, enough to recognize their endurance, enough to see how boredom became legacy. And so we might ask, in our own age, surrounded by endless records, how much will survive? Will our archives of data one day be fragments too pieced together by future historians who will wonder what we forgot, what we miscopied, and what dust accidentally preserved? Story 8. Echoes in Modern Science. What astronomers still owe to Babylon. Section 1. Cycles that never died. When modern astronomers plot the movements of the moon when they predict eclipses, when they divide the circle into 360 degrees, they are often unknowingly echoing the work of Babylonian scribes. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia, inscribed thousands of years ago with dull lines of cuneiform, did not simply vanish into history. They shaped the very structure of how we think about the sky. The most obvious legacy is the division of time and space. The Babylonians worked with a sexagesimal, or base 60 number system. To them, 60 was not an awkwardly large unit, but the foundation of calculation. They divided hours into 60 minutes, minutes into 60 seconds, and circles into 360 degrees. This choice, born of practical arithmetic, still defines our measurements today. Every time we glance at a clock or a protractor, we are using Babylonian mathematics. Cycles were another enduring gift. Babylonian scribes noticed that eclipses repeated in an 18-year cycle, now known as the Saros cycle. They tracked Venus through its 8-year pattern of appearances and the moon through its monthly phases with extraordinary care. These cycles became tools not just for omens, but for prediction. Modern astronomers still use the Saros cycle to classify and anticipate eclipses, even with satellites and telescopes at their disposal. The clay tablets and supercomputers, though, separated by millennia, sometimes speak the same language. The habit of systematic observation also traces back to Mesopotamia. The Babylonians did not rely on chance memory or poetic inspiration. They wrote everything down. Their tables of numbers, their lists of risings and settings, their endless records of eclipses created a tradition of data collection that science still depends on. Modern research, with its emphasis on recording every trial, every measurement, every anomaly, echoes the Babylonian faith in accumulation. Knowledge they believed was not found in brilliance, but in persistence. And yet the Babylonians themselves were not scientists in the modern sense. They did not seek physical explanations. For them, the stars were signs, not systems. The cycles of the heavens were messages from the gods, not laws of nature. What endured was not their worldview, but their method, the conviction that patterns matter, that numbers hold meaning, that the sky can be understood by writing it down. Modern astronomy, stripped of omens, still carries this conviction. The irony is striking. What the Babylonians catalogued for kings and priests, modern scientists use to explore galaxies and black holes. Their boredom became our foundation. Their omens became our equations. Their clay tablets pressed by anonymous hands became part of the infrastructure of knowledge that now extends to the edge of the observable universe. But this raises a quiet question. If so much of modern science rests on traditions born from boredom, what unseen practices of our own time, so ordinary, so uncelebrated, might one day be recognized as the silent backbone of future discovery? Section 2. Predictions, numbers, and the long shadow of clay. When we speak of modern astronomy, we often think of telescopes, vast mirrors gathering light satellites, orbiting Earth images of galaxies stretching billions of light years away. It feels worlds apart from clay tablets impressed by reeds, and yet the logic that underlies so much of modern practice is distinctly Babylonian, a reliance on cycles, on systematic recording, on the belief that patterns in the sky can be calculated and predicted. The Babylonians were masters of eclipse prediction. They recognized that lunar and solar eclipses recur in regular intervals, particularly in the 18-year Saros cycle. With this knowledge, they could forecast when and where eclipses might happen, even if they did not understand the mechanics of the Earth's shadow. Today, astronomers use far more precise mathematical models grounded in orbital mechanics. But the Saros cycle remains a useful tool. In tables of eclipses, printed in modern handbooks, the Babylonian fingerprint is still visible. The sexagesimal system, their base 60 mathematics, has proven equally enduring. Dividing the circle into 360 degrees was not arbitrary. It was a practical adaptation of their number system. That division filtered into Greek astronomy, into Islamic mathematics, and eventually into modern trigonometry and navigation. Every time we mark an angle, every time we divide an hour into minutes and seconds, we echo the choices of Mesopotamian scribes who found comfort in multiples of 60. Their arithmetic still measures our world. Babylonian planetary tables also carried forward. They recorded the movements of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, with painstaking detail, producing numerical schemes that could forecast positions. Some of these schemes, especially those concerning Jupiter, closely resemble what we might call early mathematical models, where arithmetic patterns stand in for physical explanations. While modern science explains planetary motion through gravity and elliptical orbits, the Babylonian emphasis on numerical regularity foreshadowed the predictive mathematics at the heart of astronomy today. Equally important was the act of record-keeping itself. Babylonian scribes recorded not just extraordinary events, but ordinary ones. Every lunar phase, every eclipse, every planetary appearance was noted, cataloged, and archived. This long baseline of observation gave later cultures, from Greek to Islamic to European, the ability to compare and refine their models. Without centuries of Babylonian data, Hipparchus could not have discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and Ptolemy could not have built the Almagest. Even now, historians use Babylonian eclipse records to study tiny variations in Earth's rotation. The clay tablets still speak their numbers, reaching into modern research. The irony, of course, is that the Babylonians pursued these records for reasons entirely different from ours. For them, an eclipse was a warning to the king Venus, a sign of prosperity or danger. They did not imagine galaxies or universal laws, yet their insistence on recording everything, even when it seemed boring or opaque, preserved the raw material of science. Their omens became our data. Their ritual duties became our equations. This raises a curious thought. How much of modern data collected today for narrow or practical reasons, economic reports, satellite logs, environmental records, may one day serve purposes we cannot imagine? Just as Babylonian omens became scientific baselines, might our own bureaucratic numbers become the seeds of future discovery? Action 3. From clay to cosmos. The story of Babylonian astronomy does not end with the fall of Babylon, nor with the last scribe pressing wedges into clay. It stretches quietly into the present. The lines they drew, the numbers they copied, the cycles they preserved, these did not remain confined to their temples. They traveled, transformed, and endured, becoming part of the scaffolding of modern science. It is easy to forget this when we look at the grandeur of today's astronomy. Satellites map the microwave background of the universe. Telescopes peer into the birthplaces of stars. Computers calculate orbital mechanics with extraordinary precision. Yet beneath all this sophistication lies a habit that is profoundly Babylonian record. Everything trusts the patterns, build knowledge, not from flashes of genius, but from the long accumulation of detail. The Babylonians had no physics, no sense of galaxies, no explanation for the mechanics of eclipses or planetary retrograde motion. What they had was patience. They wrote down what they saw over and over, century after century. They believed that nothing in the sky was trivial. And because of that, they created the first great archive of human observation, one that others could use, reinterpret, and expand. This endurance shows how history often works. What one culture does for its own reasons may become invaluable to another for entirely different purposes. The Babylonians cataloged stars as omens for kings. The Greeks turned them into geometric models. Islamic scholars refined them into tables for prayer times and navigation. Modern scientists study them for planetary cycles and the history of Earth's rotation. The meaning shifted, but the data remained. The boredom of one age became the foundation of another. In museums today, the tablets appear small and unassuming fragments of clay covered in faint wedges. To most visitors, they are little more than relics. Yet within them is a continuity that bridges thousands of years. Each broken tablet is a reminder that science rests not only on brilliance, but on persistence, not only on inspiration, but on repetition. And perhaps that is the deepest echo, the lesson that unnoticed details matter. The Babylonians cataloged stars nobody else watched yet. Those stars became part of the framework of science. In our own time, surrounded by vast archives of data, we may overlook what future generations will find essential. The quiet work we dismiss as routine may one day be seen as the cornerstone of discovery. So the story ends where it began, with the night sky over Mesopotamia, clear and dark, the rivers glinting under starlight. A scribe bends over clay, pressing wedges with his reed stylus. He does not know why he must record yet another star, why his teacher demands another line. He does not know that centuries later, Greeks, Arabs, and modern scientists will read those same marks. All he knows is that the clay must be filled. The tradition continued, and in that act of boredom he preserves the cosmos.